Manchester online update. It's the digital partner to our live event that we had at the Edwardian Hotel in Manchester on the 2nd of September. It was a terrific event. This online forum is a new departure for PCD. As we come back to live events, we're also trying to create value for our broader membership who want to find out the latest trends. We've got a panel of experts here who are going to shed some light on what's happening in the Manchester economy with private clients across many different service lines. We've got two audiences today. We've got some PCD members here with us on Zoom. We've also got an audience on YouTube. After 45 minutes, we're going to cut the stream to YouTube, and we're going to invite our PCD members to pop their cameras on and ask any questions of our panel that they like. So looking forward to a terrific hour ahead. Before we get into the discussion about some of these latest trends, I'm just going to come to each of our panelists to ask them to introduce themselves and describe what they do briefly. So I think we should kick off with Andy Wood, who was one of our sponsors on the 2nd of September. Hi there, Andy.
Hi, Dave. Hi, David. How are you doing?
Very well. So it was an enjoyable dinner at the Edwardian. I think people were happy to be out. Did you enjoy the evening?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I've been to a couple of events now over the last sort of few weeks, and you can almost feel your spirits lifting. And this is not a criticism of the people I have been surrounding myself with for the last 18 months, but it's just been so great to meet up with some different people, and as I say, you just feel your spirits lifting. So I thought it was a really good event.
Terrific. And for those who don't know you, please briefly explain what you do at ETC.
Yeah, well, I'm a tax advisor and a barrister, and ETC Tax, it pretty much does what it says on the tin, really. We're a tax advisory business, an independent tax advisory business, and that's all we do, really. Our clients are high net worth individuals and private companies, and we advise on really all aspects of the UK tax regime.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Andy, and look forward to chatting to you in a second. Ruth McCarthy at SPI Capital. Welcome, Ruth. It was great to meet you in the Manchester event. It'd be great to hear what you how you help clients and what you do for them.
Thank you, David. It was a great event and great to be along today. So yes, I'm a real estate lawyer and managing director of SPI Capital. We're a real estate consultancy, and what we do is provide strategic support and advice to high net worth investors, those who want to invest and create property portfolios in the residential property sector. So with the aim of accelerating progress, maximising their returns, and all being well, avoiding expensive mistakes which can come along.
Okay, perfect. We'll look forward to getting into some of the detail shortly. Stephen Appleton from Brabner's. Welcome, Stephen. Be great to have a quick intro from you.
Hi, thanks for having me on board. I'm the head of private clients at Brabner's in Manchester, so I advise individuals on their personal succession planning, and also business owners on succession planning, generational planning generally, and have relatively unusual for Manchester practice of advising around philanthropy as well.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you. And like I say, look forward to getting into some of the trends. Simeon Livesey from Kasno. Welcome, Simeon.
Thanks, David. There's no such thing as a free dinner, is there, David? I feel like I'm earning
your supper.
That dinner from a couple of weeks ago, and it was a great event. Thank you for the invitation. So yeah, as David said, Simeon Livesey. I am a portfolio director at the brand spanking new Kasno office in Manchester. I advise a mix of wealthy clients, but predominantly business owners and entrepreneurs across the north on investments and wider wealth.
Okay, terrific. Elisabeth Kinder from JMW. It'd be great to hear your introduction.
Morning, David. Thanks for having me. I head the family team at JMW. So we advise clients on a really broad spectrum of issues relating to their family. So whether that's a couple going into a marriage and wanting to look at wealth protection, or sadly coming out the other side of a relationship, whether or not they've been married, and the full spectrum of financial and practical implications around the arrangements for themselves and their children.
Okay, terrific. And last but not least, Adam West at RSM. Adam, you couldn't be with us on the night in Manchester, but we wanted to loop you in for this. So it'd be great to hear a little introduction from you.
Yeah, thank you, David. Yeah, I was on holiday looking after 3 young children, so you can probably still see the bags under my eyes. I head up the private client team in Manchester for RSM, with a particular focus on entrepreneurs and business owners, with a bespoke, looking at transactions and post-transactional structuring.
Okay, great. So just staying with you, Adam, getting into the conversation. When I'm speaking to advisors recently across the UK, they're saying about the volume of transactions has really been at a peak. There's a lot of in the FT, there's been stories of the banks, the M&A fees are skyrocketing. There's a lot of private equity money in the market looking and making deals with owner managers. So what are you seeing on that front?
I think that's exactly right in Manchester and across the whole of the Northwest, David. That, certainly since probably this time last year. So we had the initial start of COVID, and then that kind of went from April to summer. But certainly when we came out of the school summer holidays from September 2020, we've seen an unparalleled level of transactions in the Northwest. That's from unicorns to tech companies to your more traditional family businesses. What's great about Manchester in particular and across the Northwest is there's great geographical variety. So you've got businesses in Cheshire, you've got transport businesses in Bolton, fintech companies in Wigan. There's just a great variety, and that's why I particularly love working in the Northwest. And I think, as you alluded to there, David, I think there's probably 2 main reasons from my perspective why that kind of transaction levels kicked off around this time last year. The first is private equity, VC investors. They didn't really do too much from April to September last year because they were being cautious and keeping the money in their own pockets when they weren't sure what really was going on in the world. This time last year that they've been heavily invested, and the multiples are quite frightening in some instances. And then the second one really is probably a topic what people are bored of speaking, but it's I've had the conversation with clients this week already, and it's the potential rate increases in capital gains tax. The March 21 budget, there was a fear that, capital gains tax rates were going to go from 10% to 45%, which obviously didn't happen. And obviously, Mr. Sunak has got an autumn statement budget for the end of October. And again, the conversations are starting again as to, should we take some cash off the table? Should we take some investment, structure? So the conversations that have kind of been going on for the last 12 months are reigniting with a view to doing something before the end of October to realise some liquidity.
And on the commercial property front, are you seeing any activity? I mean, those who might own assets that have appreciated quite quickly, say in logistics or sectors that have become hot, are people just sitting tight, or is there any trends that you could read across that? Not in particular as in focus on that, but I'd say just any capital asset that is sitting on quite a big gain. People are now having serious considerations as to what to do with that because of what may happen at the end of next month. And then naturally, if people have had a liquidity event, that leads to conversation of succession planning. Maybe they've got an inheritance tax problem that they didn't have before. Yeah. Do you often step in at that phase and try and help advise what the options are? Absolutely,
David. So that's kind of part of our scope. So we'd advise on a transaction, and if there was any kind of pre-transaction planning that could be done, we'd obviously do that. And then when they come out of the transaction or the restructure, whatever it may be, they're sat with cash in their pockets. And then the tax position has changed from, being really efficient from an inheritance tax perspective to, if they die tomorrow, subject to what their will says, they may be subject to inheritance tax of 40%. So, yeah, at that point, there's probably some tax structuring that can be done. But that's the time when I speak with the guys on the rest of this call where, there might be wills need updating, there may be some investments that need doing. And that's where we link in really well with our network post-transaction.
And is that structuring often like through corporate vehicles for UK domicile people, because trusts are, they're part of the picture, but more difficult for larger liquidity events? I mean, the HMRC closed their team looking at family investment companies, didn't they, and things like that. I mean, what do you tend to? There's no typical, but what are some of the trends?
No, I mean, I think there's probably a basket, David. Really, but I think the reason why people potentially go more towards companies rather than trusts is, one, trusts kind of a less, potentially, you can't get as much money into a trust as you can as in a company. But I think business owners understand companies. They've probably built a company, they've sold the company, they understand how a company works. So that's really, in my opinion, the sole reason why someone may choose an investment company over a trust, just because of their natural understanding of how it works. So it could be through a trust, could be through a corporate. In certain circumstances, it could be better to be held personally. So there's a variety of structures that we could put in place that would help them from an inheritance tax perspective.
And we're going to talk with Stephen shortly on philanthropy trends, but is that something that you also see as an option that people are looking at, partly because COVID's as a health crisis, it encourages people to think of people in worse situations than their own? Have you noticed an uptick in that kind of ideas as well?
Absolutely. The conversations I've had in the last 18 months around wills or around gifting or philanthropy have ramped up. And, the primary driver for that is obviously mortality and COVID. We see more and more of that now going forwards.
Okay, well, thank you, Adam, for getting us underway. Elisabeth, if I could just turn to you. I mean, we heard there from Adam, a number of the liquidity events are on the rise. And from a family law perspective, I suppose, once that liquidity is there, people are thinking about their options for wealth planning, or, for example, there could be gifts that they're trying to make to family members. They might be single themselves and looking at becoming remarried. I mean, what are some of the risks and dilemmas for people who have received a liquidity event and then are looking at planning going forward?
Well, David, I'm seeing an increasingly sharp focus from the family court as to a distinction between matrimonial and non-matrimonial wealth and its treatment on divorce. With the courts really interested now, wherever possible, to try and ring fence non-matrimonial wealth. And so the structuring and the sorts of issues that Adam has identified and that his team might be looking at is increasingly important. There's a very strong line of case authorities that look at the treatment of non-matrimonial wealth. For my team, we're looking very carefully at trying to plead our cases now on the evidence relating to how non-matrimonial wealth, whether it's been gifted, inherited, pre-acquired prior to a marriage, evidentially, how has that been treated during the marriage? And if we can show that a couple have recognised a particular asset as being not generated during the marriage, and they've kept it very separate, so they've not mingled it with other matrimonial monies, then it gives us, as the lawyers, a very strong argument to run, say that wealth should be protected. And in terms of trying to mitigate that risk, whilst pre and post nuptial agreements are still very useful tools, and in Adam's description there of a liquidity event, we might advise a client to look at a pre or a post nuptial agreement. Some families or individuals still find them unromantic, not particularly English, and aren't keen to look at them. So your next best option in thinking about protecting against risk would be very careful structuring to try and protect non-matrimonial wealth.
So one scenario might be the business owner in their 50s, 50 to 60, they've got an adult daughter who's just going into a relationship. They want to give them a substantial lump sum to buy a property, for example, or further gifts. That kind of scenario falls into where you'd want to be looking carefully at that substantial gift and saying, well, in that relationship, a lot of things could happen, but how can you protect it for your daughter, say, if you're is that a kind of scenario that you see fitting the gifting side and looking at how you protect it?
Absolutely. And using that example, you might be looking at a loan initially if we are thinking short-term succession planning, and we're not overly concerned about the potential inheritance tax further down the line. But of course, the older that individual becomes when they're looking at gifting wealth, a loan's unlikely to be the best way to deal with it, and they may well want to pass the wealth directly to the daughter. So you're then looking at whether you're looking at a declaration of trust or a pre or post nuptial agreement, but also thinking about how that gift then is ultimately used by her, and looking to try and ensure that she doesn't use other matrimonial monies to strengthen the value of the gift itself, and tries to keep the gift separate from everything else that relates to the marriage, so that if she then goes through a divorce, she has those legal arguments to run to say this was a gift, we've never used it as being matrimonial money, we've kept it very separate, and it should therefore be ring-fenced and protected on the divorce.
I mean, on the prenup side, do you see the parental level, if a gift is coming? Obviously mentioned before that it's not the most romantic thing, but if it's kind of contingent and coming from the parental level, do you see that scenario happening rather than the person in their 20s who's getting married thinking pursuing it?
Yeah, and often we will say to clients in that scenario, parents looking at gifting wealth, blame the advisors. When the young couple are not particularly liking the idea of a prenup and feeling that is there a degree of suspicion around my intentions towards your daughter, we'll blame the advisors, because prenuptial agreements are an invaluable tool. And whilst the family court does retain its discretion as to how to deal with assets, even if a prenup exists, it is strong evidence to support that there was always an intention to keep the gifted wealth very separate from everything else.
And they're much more commonly used now, aren't they? I mean, there was a time when this was a novel idea or something that was more fringe, if you like, wasn't it? But they've really kind of become the mainstay, haven't they, now in the toolkit?
Absolutely, yeah. Over the last decade, the guidance from the family courts is very clear that they are a useful tool and should be considered.
I mean, for people who've built a business over a long time while they've been married, if they sell that business for a substantial amount, then get divorced, I mean, there's no what kind of principles apply from the family court? I mean, it's often a sort of a 50-50 style split, is it? Or what might a business owner who's been married 25 years built a business? What's the implications for them? Are they? How would that be dealt with by the courts?
So we're looking very carefully then at the provenance of the wealth. If the business has been established during the marriage, built up during the marriage, and possibly exited during the marriage, then yes, in that scenario, the legal arguments are difficult to run to shift away from equality. Not impossible, and there may be other factors in play that might point towards a departure from equality, particularly if a business is being retained. So if a business has been built up during the marriage, but there's no exit during the marriage, then the business owner would be saying, well, I carry a huge amount of risk with my business. It's an illiquid asset, and those factors should point against an equal division, with the non-business owner perhaps having a great share of the liquid capital to offset that.
And I guess a holding in a family company that's been very long-standing, again, is more nuanced, again, isn't it, than a business, as you say, created in the marriage and built up. There's lots of considerations there.
Yeah, absolutely. And with a family investment company, very often they're structured in a way where there is a loan to the business which protects in the event of a subsequent divorce.
Okay. Well, look, thank you, Elisabeth, for running us through that. Very, very interesting. Just going to come to Simeon Livesey from Kasno. Hi there, Simeon.
Hi, David.
So it'd be interesting to hear a little bit about the story of the new Kasno office in Manchester. What the logic was behind setting up an office, the kind of clients you're starting to attract. It'd be great to hear a little bit more about that story.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, David. So we are 10 months in now to having boots on the ground and a presence in Manchester. It's a great city to be in. I think it was recently voted one of the top 3 cities in the whole world. So it's a bit of good fortune that we did decide to open here, I think. But it is part of a regional expansion strategy for Kasno across the UK. So recently offices have been opened in Birmingham, in Bristol, We've got ambitions to open an office in Leeds shortly as well. Why are Kasno doing that? Wealth management is fed by corporate activity. We've already heard that there's been a big increase in corporate activity. Even during the pandemic, it doesn't seem to show any signs of slowing down, not just in the Northwest, but across the regions of the UK. So I think strategically it makes a lot of sense. What Kasno have done is they've signed off on a long-term strategy. So the expectation isn't that we appear for a couple of years and then disappear, as some wealth management firms have done from time to time. But we build a long-term viable business. So that's started already, which is great. We spent the last 10 months doing quite a bit of brand awareness in the professional community, because although Kasno has a great brand in the south, it's not quite as well known in the north. So that's been quite fun, getting out and meeting all the key professional advisors to tell them what we offer and what is it that we offer. What is it that made Kasno think that we can make an impression in the north of England? I think it's bringing that global expertise, that global investment knowledge that we have, but combining it with a local presence. And I think that really is key. There's so much that you can do remotely, but I think particularly with the entrepreneurs and business owners we're hoping to work with, I think that local advisor presence helps to differentiate as well.
Sure. I mean, are there any kind of investment themes or trends that you're seeing playing out amongst the client base? I mean, we talk a lot, and a lot of copy is written around things like ESG and sustainable investment. Are there anything that you're observing from the clients that they're interested in learning more about and implementing in portfolios?
Yeah, there's some. I'd say no two clients are the same, but sure. one or two common themes. Sustainability is one, particularly for younger entrepreneurs and business owners, and also the next generation of inherited wealth as well. In the conversations we're having with those groups, it's clear that many of them want to make a social impact as well as a return on their investments. So how do we respond to that kind of demand? Well, sustainability is baked into the investment portfolios that we have at Kasno. For example, I think we're fairly unique in that in our common reporting, in our standard reporting, we will tell clients what the carbon footprint of the portfolio is. And we also calculate the social dividend that the underlying companies make to society. So it makes clients very aware of what's going on. It's fairly standard in our general portfolios, but we can take it a step further and bespoke investment arrangements more if clients have a real appetite for us to do that.
Okay, very interesting. And we're going to chat with Stephen Appleton about some of the philanthropy trends. So it'd be interesting to see on the sustainability side as well if that plays out there. But when I was working in banking, dealing with clients in the Northwest, often they were very long property, big believers in real estate. How do you kind of start to convince them that they should actually be diversifying and having some of their wealth in liquid portfolios or in different investment products? I always found it quite a challenging conversation given the wealth that's been created in real estate. But how do you find that?
Absolutely. And if you can find a technique for telling a client to sell their properties, let me know. It's really interesting in the real estate space at the moment. We're seeing a couple of things. We're seeing clients that have traditionally bought lots of property and held them directly keep their powder dry at the moment because of concerns of a bubble in property prices. So lots of our clients, they do like to buy property, but they like to feel they're getting a good deal. There's a shortage of good deals out there at the moment because there is so much demand and so much liquidity there to just go out and buy them when they do go onto the market. So interestingly, we have seen some clients that traditionally put a lot of additional money in property just say, well, let's hold fire, let's just wait and see what happens to the property market. But interestingly, we are also seeing some clients selling down their property portfolios, which is really interesting because it is unusual. And when we speak to clients about the rationale for that, it tends to be particular kinds of property clients. So property clients that might have built their portfolio over a 20, 30, 40-year period and have made some incredible gains on those property portfolios. And they're looking down the line at the next 10 years, and they are looking at the increasing costs of making those property portfolios energy efficient and sustainable, the significant investment that will need to be made in the portfolios to do that, and the additional work. And they're looking at the gains that they've made now, and one or two are saying, well, do you know what, this appears to be a good time to sell down the portfolio because I don't have the energy, the desire to make the additional investments to secure the long-term performance of the portfolio. So again, for those clients, we can talk about diversification and other asset classes to put their money into.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you for that, Simeon. A perfect opportunity to bring in Ruth McCarthy just to talk about some of the, pick up some of those points there from traditional real estate investors. I mean, Ruth, it would be great to get your perspective on whether it's a good time to buy residential property in the Northwest, or what are you seeing clients doing? I mean, it'd be interesting for you to respond as well to sort of some of Simeon's experience speaking to clients.
Oh, thank you, David. And just to pick up, Simeon made some really excellent points that we tend to deal with on a day-to-day basis. In our business, we deal with high net worths. They have come into money through a liquidity event, whether that's selling a business, divorce, inheritance, and they want to make that money work for them. So our typical client will have a number of goals, and most will be looking towards wealth preservation. They don't want to lose what they've built up, and wealth growth. So they certainly don't want to be investing in anything which is going to see them lose money. And go into property just as an asset class. Well, over the years, the UK, particularly the residential property market, has been widely viewed as a stable asset class. Since 1952, house prices have doubled every 9 years. So you've got that very kind of strong backdrop of growth. And that's what we're seeing at the minute. If you turn on the television month on month, residential property prices are increasing, notwithstanding Brexit, notwithstanding the pandemic. But I think it would be too simple to just leave it at that and without kind of addressing Simeon's points. The market isn't equal. Not all asset classes are good investments. Not all property is a good investment. So if we're looking at an investor, you start with their goals, their strategy. For someone who wants to create wealth and passive income through property, we steer them away from the types of assets that Simeon's talking about, those which are going to result in a lot of expenditure further down the line, issues of future proofing, all of that, unless they're set up as a business to do that. So we're finding that, yes, there are landlords that are divesting of assets, but equally, there are a lot of people coming into the market because of the strength of the residential property market as an investment class. You have the funds that are all over the private rental sector. You have individual investors who are getting into the market, but they're looking for a particular type of return, a particular type of yield. Some assets, some properties are performing particularly well. You look at the Northwest as an area. If you look at the UK, which had house price growth of 7.8% last year, the Northwest will outperform that. Compare it to London, which struggles to really make any growth. So it's not a case of one size fits all. There's still a huge disparity in house price in amounts between the north and the south. Liverpool, average house prices are around £135,000. London, it's £500,000. So for an investor who wants growth, who wants yield, who wants to make some money for property, we would steer them away from the London market, and we would speak to them about the Northwest. And then within the Northwest, we would look at certain types of housing within the Northwest that would, again, it's all about strategy, having a strategy. Where does an investor want to get to? And then looking at the assets that really mean that they can fulfill whatever strategy that they've agreed on.
I mean, does COVID throw up any long-term changes and trends in the residential property market that you see? Are people looking for different things? Is city centres going to be as popular? Does the Northwest benefit from people working from home and relocating out of London? What do you see as COVID's impact on the property market? Is it a temporary thing, or are there some long-term shifts and changes going on?
It's a good point, because again, houses have seen greater increases in price than apartments. Apartments fell out of favour in lockdown. People were desperate to kind of almost do an exodus from city centres, as people weren't working in cities. And, the thought of being cooped up in a flat with no outdoor space and perhaps without, a proper office setup meant that there was a lot of people who, looked at more rural settings. So you have certainly, and we've seen it, much more of a push for people buying houses in more rural settings, so more green space. And, I think, is it a flash in the pan where people run back to the cities? I think it's going to be a bit of both. I certainly don't see the death of the city centre as a location, whether that's for offices or for housing. People will want to always live in a city centre environment. But if flexible working is here to stay, and I would suggest that it is, well, it gives people a lot more flexibility in terms of where they live. So they can live a little bit further out from where the office is. So you will have changes in trends, just like if you look at the international property market. There's been a huge increase in people buying second homes. South of France, islands, the Spanish islands, they're seeing real growth in property activity, because for that same reason, people are changing how they live, how they work, and that is having a knock-on effect. And I do think, to be honest, a lot of it will be here to stay. Will the developers respond to that, build more housing as opposed to apartments? They will, they'll have to, because it's supply and demand. They will build what a buyer wants.
And do you see international demand for residential property coming through? As the brand of kind of Manchester and the Northwest more now in favour and more known to clients internationally than previously sort of flocked to London? Do you see that filter through, or are you mainly dealing with a domestic investor base that wants to just get access to good deal flow and see opportunities?
We deal with both, David. So we have some clients who are international. We've got some expat clients who are looking at investing in the UK. The UK is known worldwide as being a stable market. But as you quite rightly point out, traditionally, investors, particularly the Asian investor, would have looked to London and buying a prime London property. That's slightly changing, where people are becoming more aware of the Northern Powerhouse, the North. Yes, football puts cities like Manchester and Liverpool on the maps. We're certainly seeing a lot more interest from international buyers in investing in UK residential property, and also looking towards the cities. It's not at a stage where people will look far beyond Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham. That's where I would probably draw a line. And for a lot of our more domestic investors, they're looking at other locations, your Warringtons, your Prestons, your Wiggins, places like that. So they do tend to focus on Manchester and Liverpool. But the international market, as travel opens up, we're getting more interest, and they tend to like new build stock versus existing assets. They're not. We find with the overseas investors, they haven't quite cottoned on to the idea of what they refer to as second-hand stock, so they like to buy something that's new. So again, that's where they'll kind of still go to the newer developments, whereas a lot of our investors like a nice cash flowing asset from day one, which is an existing and already built property. So you've got different buying requirements from the overseas and the domestic market.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for that, Ruth. Just coming to Andy Wood, obviously on the tax position of property investments is very crucial, Andy, and I know something you deal on a lot with clients. I mean, for domestic investors, are there any considerations in terms of how property portfolios are held? Any concerns that you see from people, and how they can kind of optimize themselves where they've built a portfolio? What kind of things do they consider from a tax perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's perhaps worth sort of going back, I think, to the points which Simeon and Ruth and to an extent Adam raised, and talking about individuals and some reasons why they may be divesting from residential property. And Simeon mentioned about sort of, I guess, pulling some of these properties, kicking and screaming into sort of the modern age and costs for making them energy efficient and meeting various regulations. And I completely agree. It's additional cost, isn't it, for a landlord? And it starts chipping away at the economics of running a portfolio. And one of the biggest, I guess, increased expenses for your average landlord is going to be the increase in tax. So, last few years, we've had, the inability for some landlords to get full deductions for interest on mortgages, which essentially creates phantom profits, which become taxable. We've got things like, stamp duty has become, like a three-headed monster really for purchasing. And there's a huge transaction cost for people purchasing property. This year alone, we had the additional surcharge for non-resident purchases, which again is just an added cost of purchasing property. And of course, going for, and this is touching on what Adam mentioned, that there are certainly eyes on what's going to happen to capital gains tax. So for an individual who owns properties in their own name, if they wait and see for 2 years, does their tax rate on a disposal increase substantially? For your corporate landlords, corporation tax is increasing as well to 25%. And I think it would be the case that your average landlord wouldn't be able to avail themselves of the smaller or marginal rates of corporation tax just because of how the rules apply. So all of that, from a tax point of view, perhaps doesn't necessarily make it, certainly to the, let's say, that the smaller or amateur landlord, doesn't look particularly attractive, does it?
And for the international buyers, do you see, like Ruth was saying, visibility for Manchester is strong, partly from football, but also familiarity now, more investors coming in, London investment necessarily not the first port of call. They're looking more, investing with more confidence. Do you see that filtering through?
Yeah, well, I totally agree. And I think that perhaps it's not just the, obviously the football effect is, sure, is significant, but perhaps not the only thing driving potential purchases into sort of the regional cities. I mean, I think it's probably a couple of years ago now when I was at your event in Hong Kong. So I'll drop I'll drop the PCD name into my answer. But you could walk around the streets when where there wasn't a curfew or insurrection happening on the corner anyway. you walk the streets, and there would be posters advertising new complexes in Manchester and Birmingham. Come and see our, come to our property events, sign up, buy a property off plan, and that kind of just sort of tags on to what Ruth was saying. It's a bit odd, isn't it? I mean, Ruth's saying, and I totally agree, that purchasers tend to be motivated to buy new properties, but actually, particularly a lot of the sort of Far Eastern clients are very focused on yield, and what tends to be the case is that the new properties, if you compare them to sort of I was talking to Ruth yesterday about sort of properties for sort of key workers and things like that. That is really where you're going to generate your yield, but on an expensive new property, perhaps it's not quite the case. But we've seen interest in things like student accommodation and things like that as well, where where the sort of purchaser is looking to obtain yield more than anything else, an income yield.
And do you think Manchester and the Northwest will benefit from COVID, with people thinking more broadly about not just developing stuff in London, but being based elsewhere, or maybe taking a business to somewhere that's more practical to run from, and location becomes less important, but infrastructure is still critical? Do you think that there can be a benefit from that has a longer term impact?
Well, as a Yorkshireman, I perhaps shouldn't be saying this, but I think the Northwest and Manchester does have a lot going for it. I think that there are a lot of good places to work. There's a lot of really good sort of professional workforce here, and I think I don't think Manchester perhaps suffers some brain drain that it might have done many years ago. I think you see a lot of professionals. I suppose there was graduates, but professionals staying around after graduating. In our own business, we've recruited people who ordinarily you might have thought would have gone to London, but have been happy with what sort of the Northwest and Manchester has to offer. And I do say Manchester perhaps more than Altrincham and Cheshire where we are, but Altrincham itself is a town which has benefited incredibly from the hard work of sort of local sort of chambers of commerce and things like that, but also a slightly novel approach to redeveloping a town, which is not necessarily to try and get lots and lots of new shops into vacant units, but to sort of transform that into more sort of leisure and residential space to bring people back into the town. It's been very successful.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Andy. Stephen Appleton, just to come to you, last speaker, but last but not least, it'd be great to get some reflections from you, first of all, on some of the things that people have been saying about transactions. And, I know corporate colleagues you mentioned in our planning call have been very busy. Are there trends that you've seen that other speakers have outlined?
Yeah, definitely. I'm a lot of the clients that I act for are business owners. And so, some have sold businesses. I'm a trustee of a trust that's recently sold a business. And certainly it feels like there's a lot going on at the moment. Talking to my corporate colleagues, a lot of that does seem to be driven by capital gains tax and a concern that's going to be increased. And certainly, when deal volume dropped through the floor in spring last year, we seem to have completely turned around and almost erased that dead period from our memories, or the corporate team have, because I think they've made up for it in the following months. But yeah, interesting times at the moment.
And following liquidity events, there's decisions to make around succession planning, and you've built a successful practice around philanthropy and advising on that. I mean, perhaps you could share a little bit more about what you see in terms of trends in philanthropy in the Northwest.
Yeah, sure. So where I tend to get involved is around succession planning, and so it could be that there's been a liquidity event. That's certainly one of the areas where I would get involved, where someone's starting to think about, what do I do with this money in the context of it going to the next generation or into the wider family. But also when people are thinking about just doing their wills and where, what am I doing with my wealth? And there was a fairly high profile statement by Daniel Craig recently where he said that he thought that inheritance was distasteful, and he seemed to sell it on the basis that he'd either spend all his money or give it away during his lifetime, which if any of you have ever met a private client will almost certainly never happen. But what I am seeing from a lot of clients, and this isn't necessarily in response to Daniel Craig, and because I I was seeing this increase before, but a lot of clients are starting to question whether just giving all of their wealth to their children is the right thing to do, particularly where there is sufficient wealth that the child and potentially subsequent generations won't have to work. And so it's been a really interesting conversation to have, because what it's then obviously led on to is, well, what do we do with that money? So there are sort of the two main conversations that are kicked out of that is, well, what do we do with the money? Do we do that now? Do we do that on death? How do we do that? And also, how do we manage the children's response to this? Because in many cases, children will have an expectation. There's a societal expectation that parents will leave all their money to their children. And, I've had clients where you're talking sort of 100 million wealth, saying, I'm going to leave £1 million to each of them. The last thing we should be doing is waiting until the parents have fallen off their perch to have that conversation with the children, because a worrying number of children structure their finances around unexpected inheritance. So that's created additional interesting challenges and conversations as well.
And I guess without those conversations, that's where disputes might arise, particularly if it's like that, the scale, as you say, like £100 million estate, and expectations and challenges from the next generation can arise unless they're actually tackled, as you say, and resolved in some respect.
And I think it's really all about bringing them on board. And, a really great example that everyone will have heard of is Warren Buffett's approach. So he's kind of said, there should be enough for them to do anything, but not so much that they can do nothing. But as part of what he does, he very much brings them on board with his philanthropy. And so he encourages them and expects them to go off and develop their own philanthropic endeavors, both in terms of money and time. And so that's a really good way of doing it. So you're not just taking money away from the children, you're kind of replacing it with something else. You're allowing them to develop a passion for themselves. So it gives, one of the ways that you can approach it is to, set aside a pot of money now to start doing philanthropic work. However you do that, whether it's through setting up your own charity, identifying donor advised funds that could support you, community foundations, but very much involving the next generation in making that happen and getting involved in decisions and deciding where that money goes. And that becomes part of the family's story. And that's quite a good way of changing the story on what's happened. It's not just, I'm taking this away from you, you can't have it. They're very much involved in the process.
And I mean, does gift aid come into it? I mean, I suppose it's a factor, isn't it? But I mean, people are obviously reducing the value of their estate, but do people put that into the mix when they're thinking about the timing and things like that?
There's a lot of research.
Go on.
Yeah, there's a lot of research around the things that make people give. And interestingly, tax is almost uniformly very, very, very low down on the list. It is a factor with people. If I can, taking myself as an example, if I have X amount of money I want to give away and I give it to an environmental charity, I'll get tax relief on that. If I give it to Greenpeace, I won't, because they're not a registered charity. Does that influence which one I go for? So I think it does have an influence sometimes on people when people have already made a decision to give. But I don't think that in very many cases, certainly in the UK, where the tax incentive to give is far less generous generally than perhaps it is in the US, I don't see that many people who give driven by saving tax, because you still have to give away significantly more than you're going to save, if that makes sense.
Utilize the reduction in the IHT rate around giving a portion. Is that in people's consciousness, as it were, when they're chatting?
So that's a really easy in when you're having conversations about wills, where you can say, you give 10% of your taxable estate to charity, and this is the resultant loss to your beneficiaries, and it's a relatively tiny proportion that the beneficiaries will lose out on in order for the charities to get a significant amount of money. And I find that that's a very easy, I don't want to say sell because I'm not trying to force them to give the money to charity. But they, you know, a lot of clients aren't aware of these things. And so just raising that and saying, you know, did you know you can do this? A lot of clients say, oh, no, I didn't know I could do that. You know, it's almost as simple as, did you know you could appoint an executor? Did you know you can have a trust? And so, you know, there's always an element of trying to gauge where the client is in terms of their giving, and there are some clients that are simply not open to that conversation, but many are. And I think that we're seeing, certainly in the world that we live in, where we're seeing that you know, our existing systems of taxation and what have you are probably not fully supporting the need that there is, that in a way that has existed in America for decades. You know, I think those who have been successful in life are starting to feel that they need to make a bigger contribution than perhaps they have. And, you know, perhaps, you know, I don't know if Andy sees this, but, you know, a lot of people don't trust the government to spend the tax wisely. So they think, well, I think I can spend that money that I would have spent on tax more wisely, and I can direct it to causes that are important to me and that I think will have a wider social impact. So that's, you know, that is an angle that some people come at it from.
Andy, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I think in many aspects, actually, I guess of a sort of, let's say, an entrepreneurial family's affairs, that maintaining control is tantamount to de-risking everything. But you're absolutely right. You know, I mean, historically, it was always that was the reason why they wanted to sort of, you know, put in place, I guess, structures that would make their affairs more efficient for tax purposes, was because, well, if I just give it to the government, they waste it. And I think Stephen's right when it's coming now to sort of, you talk about philanthropy. Yeah, they can give them away to other charities, but actually there's a lot of interest in setting up their own structures and foundations. And sometimes I think you're absolutely right, Stephen, when you make the comparison between Greenpeace and other sort of and the registered charities, that actually you do find that some entrepreneurial people will forego the tax status which comes being registered, just so that they don't have, you know, in their view, the charity commission snooping into what they do, and the various sort of straitjacket that might impose. So yeah, it does flow various ways, I think.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're going to draw our panel to an end today, and then we're going to cut the live stream and invite a couple of our PCD members